Prynhawn da i chi gyd, a diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am ymuno gyda ni ar gyfer ein gwemena heddi i baratoi i ddarparu'r cymhwyster dilyniant mewn gwaith toi, llechi a theils. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much for joining us for our webinar on how to prepare to deliver the progression qualification in roof slating and tiling. Rydym yn gweithio adre, felly ymddeiriadau ymlaen llaw am unrhyw sŵn yn y cefndir ac unrhyw oedi yn y sleidiau. We are all working from home, therefore I apologise in advance for any background noise and any delay in the slides. Dyma'r nawfed webinar y meysydd masnach unigol ar gyfer y Cymhwyster dilyniant. Gallwch gyfrestru ar gweddill y gweminarau yma ar wefan Sgiliau i Gymru. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi ymunodd yn y gweminarau ar gyfer y sylfaen. Mae bob recordiad ar wefan Sgiliau i Gymru. This is the 9th in a series of webinars on the individual trade-specific areas for the progression qualification. The links to register on all remaining webinars can be found on the Skills for Wales website. Thank you to all who joined the Foundation webinars. All recordings can be found on the Skills for Wales website. Fe fyddwch yn derbyn e-bost cyn diwedd y gwebinar gyda link i'n harolwg a'r pwynt pŵer yma yn y Gymraeg a'r Saesneg. Byddem yn ddiolchgar iawn byddwch yn cymeryd yr amser i lenwi ein harolwg, gan bod eich adborth yn werthfawr iawn i ni. You will receive an email before the session ends with a link to a survey and also the PowerPoint in English and Welsh. We would be very grateful if you could take the time to fill in this survey, as your feedback is very valuable to us. Dyma beth fyddwn ni'n trwyddo prynhawn yma. Fe fyddwn yn esbonio pam mae gennym ni y cymwysterau newydd yma, ac yna yn edrych ar gynnwys y cymhwyster dilyniant gan edrych ar gwaith toi, llechi a theils yn benodol. Fe fydden nhw'n edrych ar strwythur yr unedau ac yn rhoi amlinelliad o'r asesiadau. Yna, fe fydden nhw'n edrych ar adnoddau a fydd ar gael i chi cyn symud ymlaen at y camau nesaf. Fe fydden nhw'n edrych ar y trefniadau trosiannol sydd yna i chi, ac i gloi, fe fydden nhw'n rhoi y cyfle i chi ofyn unrhyw gwestiynau. Plis rowch eich cwestiynau yn y tab cwestiynau sydd ar y llaw dde o'ch sgrin. This is what we'll be discussing this afternoon. We'll be briefly going over the transformation of these new qualifications. We will look at the progression qualification content, looking specifically on roof slating and tiling. We will look at the structure of the units and outline of the assessments. We will then have a look at the resources that are available for you before moving on to the next steps. We will then go over the transition arrangements that are in place. We will then give you an opportunity for you to ask us any questions. Please type any questions that you may have throughout this webinar in the Questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Fe fydd y cyflwyniad yn para tua awr, gyda hanner awr i ateb unrhyw gwestiynau. The presentation will last around an hour, with 30 minutes for questions. Felly dyma i chi eich cyflwynwyr heddi. Here are your presenters today. We have David Pye, who's the Technical Advisor for Building Services at City and Guilds. Also have Ian Roberts, who's the Technical Advisor for Construction at City and Guilds, and myself, Angharad Lloyd-Bainan, who's the Business Development Manager for City and Guilds for Wales. Nawr fe gen I Paul sydyn I wybod am eich dealltwriaeth chi am y cymwysterau newydd yma. Now we will have a quick poll to get your understanding of the new qualification. Please rowch eich lefydd o ddealltwriaeth gyda 5 yr uchaf. Please give your level of understanding with 5 being the highest. Felly sut byddech yn disgrifio eich dealltwriaeth o'r gymhwyster dilyniant? Please rate your understanding of the progression qualification. Great, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. O hyd yn ddiddorol I weld yr ateb. Thank you very much. Always interesting to see the results there. And hopefully by the end of the webinar, you will have a greater understanding of the progression qualification. We will now look at the transformation of these new qualifications. So why have these qualifications coming into Wales in September. So in February 2018, Qualifications Wales published the Building the Future report, which was a sector review of qualifications and the qualification system in construction and the built environment in Wales. The report summarised the views of learning providers and a range of professional and representative bodies, together with more than 100 employers and over 900 learners. It included findings from their own review of a sample of qualifications and an international comparison study. Qualifications Wales' outlining findings were that there was inconsistent assessment practice, assessment is often not well managed and quality assurance can be inconsistent, with some areas of learning not effectively assessed. There was a need for learners to be able to deal with a range of tasks and to be able to problem solve, which we have incorporated into the new qualifications, with aspects such as planning and evaluation skills. There was a need that qualifications needed to meet the skills needs of Wales, such as heritage buildings, traditional materials, tools and techniques, and how they have changed over time. We also found the need to rationalise the amount of 400 plus technical and vocational qualifications in the construction and built environment sector, and a need for having coherence in these qualifications. And it was also noted that it was important to keep the portability between the nations. So the Consortium of EL and City and Guilds have been working with sector bodies to facilitate this and using recognised standards for each trade. So whilst developing these new qualifications, we have been engaging with a number of stakeholders. Therefore, the content has been developed in conjunction with a number of stakeholders, such as technical consultants from across Wales, technical working groups and forums, so various focus groups, stakeholder forums and BACH, current practitioners across Wales, spoken to industry, including micro, small, medium and large contractors across the sector, and all this through the agreement with Qualifications Wales. On this next slide, it just gives you an overview of any questions that you may have regarding the progression qualification. And as I mentioned earlier, you will have a copy of this presentation, therefore it's just useful for you to be able to refer back to. This slide shows you the progression qualification, so the various options for the learner. So option A would be the learner would complete 1 year in full-time learning before securing an apprenticeship. Option B would be the learner complete 2 years in full-time learning before securing an apprenticeship. And option C would be that the learner would have a direct entry onto an apprenticeship, and the apprenticeships will be made available from 2022. The foundation qualification is the entry point for learners who wish to start their journey towards occupational competence in a construction or building services engineering trade. The progression qualification has been designed as an optional second year for learners to do after the foundation. It is particularly useful as a meaningful programme of study in full-time education if a learner has not secured an apprenticeship place. Hoffwn nawr eich trosglwyddo draw i David Pye a fydd yn eich tywysg trwy y sleidiau nesaf. I would now like to pass you over to David Pye, who will take you through the next few slides. Diolch, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne Harrod, and welcome everyone. As Anne Harrod said in the opening script, please do ignore any unwanted background noise. We're working from home and presenting this presentation from home, but we'll try and keep all of that to a minimum. This first slide, we'd like to introduce you to the joint branded documents relating to the progression qualification. The qualification is a starting point, or the qualification handbook, should I say, is a starting point and contains information on staffing, resources, summary of assessment and qualification content. But alongside this, you'll also have an assessment pack and project pack, which gives in-depth information on the assessment requirements, such as centres practicals, resource lists, how to conduct centre assessments, These will all be available in Welsh language and will be available shortly on the consortium website. Now let's consider the important rules of combination. There are 3 core units, which are Unit 201, Employment and Employability in the Construction Sector. This unit will cover things such as relevant bodies within the sector, main principles of self-employment, personal skills, and problem solving. Moving on to Unit 202, Changing Practices over Time. Typically, this unit will cover the changing construction and built environment sector, changes in construction materials, the tools and the techniques over time, the relationship between trades and the environment, and connected practice in the construction and building services engineering. And then finally, Unit 203 is planning and evaluating work in the construction sector in Wales. And this unit will cover calculating costs and determining resource requirements, planning of work, and the importance of evaluating that work. So those are the core units. Let's move on and have a look at the trade-specific units. So in this pathway, roof slating and tiling, you'll see the 3 core units we've discussed, and then roof slating and tiling knowledge, installation of underlay and battens, installation of single lap roofs, installation of plain tile roofs, install preformed weather flashings, install regular size natural roof slate, and strip and reclaim roof coverings. So the GLH for this qualification is 540 hours, and this is the time the average learner is anticipated to study and be assessed under supervision. This is broken down into 100 hours for the core, 378 hours for the pathway, and 62 hours for the assessment. Total qualification time also factors in the additional time a learner will spend on their own study, such as research and revision. So the qualification has a TQT of 600 hours, which is 60 credits. Now I'd like to pass you on to my colleague Ian to take you through the next section. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, David and Ann-Harad, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. What we'd now like to do is take a look into the actual units themselves. There is always a temptation to look at assessments and work backwards to delivery. But if we consider the qualification handbook and the details in the units, we will get a full outlook of the content to be delivered. Just a reminder that the learning outcome is the overview. The assessment criteria starts to detail what outcome is expected for successful assessment, and the range indicates the breadth of knowledge and skills to be covered. All elements of the range must be covered in the delivery. In this slide, you can see that we have highlighted Unit 202, and that's changing practices over time. The top of the page will always show the unit number and title. Then the guided learning hours, which for this unit is 45 hours. It then goes on to describe a brief overview of the unit. In this instance, it is for learners to gain knowledge and understanding of how materials, tools and techniques have changed and adapted from 1919, as well as looking to the future. This is something tutors delivering this content may have to carry out additional research or CPD to update their knowledge and understanding. This is no different to what we have had to carry out previously, when we've had to teach new content. And then immediately below, you will see the learning outcomes. In this instance, learning outcome 1. And it's worth noting at this point that there is 3 learning outcomes for all the units. And the 3 learning outcomes have got the same title to ensure the consistency across all the units. But then, of course, they'll be contextualized to each pathway. One key difference compared to current qualifications is that we tend not to use active verbs such as state, explain, and describe in the criteria. This was to enable the content to be assessed in various different ways. But the depth of content, and we'll see that on the next slide, which will be shown in the blue box, will give you a good description as to what depth the content needs to be taught. Following on, we can see the learning outcome discussed on an earlier slide, and this is learning outcome 2 from Unit 202. The title is Know the Changes in Construction Methods Over Time. And when we look at criteria 2.1, we can see the heading pre-1919 construction methods, and then the range is immediately beneath. We then build up to 2.3, and that is the 21st century construction techniques and technologies. We could then ask ourselves, what does this cover? And this is where we consider the range. And in this instance, it's off-site manufacturing, prefabricated construction components, 3D printing of construction components, etc. Then we can ask, to what depth? And then the depth in the lower blue box describes further the expected outcomes. So let's have a closer look at 2.3, which states learners will know emerging methods of construction for 21st century buildings. This should include the materials, tools, and techniques relevant to their chosen trade. The depth of content is there to provide you with the information you will require to the depth of coverage that is required. To help reinforce this message from the previous slide and to show our pathway, roof slating and tiling units, we will take a quick look at Unit 236, Install, Underlay, Battens and Roofing Components, and at the bottom of the slide there is outcomes 1, 2 and 3. And as I've mentioned earlier, these are standard learning outcome titles for all pathways. We have the same layout and structure with plenty of information to guide the depth of delivery. And you can also see the brief description on what is this unit about. On this next slide, we can now see it is the same layout. And following on from the previous slide, we have learning outcome 3 from Unit 236 and the depth of content that has to be covered. For example, criteria 3.2, we can see the criteria and the range that has to be covered. Then in the blue box, we can see the delivery outcome and the depth of content that has to be covered. When we look closely, it states learners should be able to measure the roof, cut, fix underlay, calculate datum, and even gauge by measuring the rafter length at various points to determine the courses in line with specification. The range and depth of content that will also have to be covered. It is worth noting at this point that the criterion range to cover is extracted from the occupational competency statements set by industry and is to enable a smooth transition when the learner is gaining successful employment. So I'd now like to take a look at the assessments. The progression qualification is assessed using 3 assessment methods, which is very similar to the foundation qualification. We start with the on-screen assessment, which is a multiple choice questions. It is externally set and externally marked with an overall weighting of 20%. The practical project will cover 1 trade pathway. In this instance, it's roof slating and tiling. It's externally set, internally marked with a weighting of 60%. And then lastly, the guided discussion, which is externally set and internally marked with a weighting of 20%. And as many learners prefer hands-on experience, this weighting of assessments will identify and reward demonstrated skills within the practical project. But we will, however, be going through each method of assessment in the up and coming slides. But before we move on, I would like to reinforce that week commencing Monday the 10th of May, we will have an assessment pack detailing the requirements of the assessments, which will be available then to download from the Skills for Wales website, along with the qualification handbook. The on-screen assessments, covering the 3 core units, is 70 minutes long and contains 45 multiple choice questions. It is recommended that this is taken prior to the practical and guided discussion. The practical project is made up of 3 tasks that require the learner to plan, perform, and evaluate. This has to be taken before the guided discussion. The guided discussion contains 2 parts, including the learner's reflection on the practical project. And this method of assessment is externally set, internally marked, and externally verified. And the guided discussion, as a reminder, can only take place once the learner has completed the practical project. It's worth noting that these 3 methods of assessments are graded between pass and distinction. And then an overall grade will then be awarded accordingly. The health and safety assessment at the bottom of the screen is not part of the qualification and is not a mandatory requirement. It is to allow the learner to move forward in readiness to carry out the CSCS health and safety test to gain a CSCS card, and can be taken at any stage of the assessment process. And to be honest, this may have already been taken while working towards their foundation qualification. The content within the qualification covers all aspects of learning required, which means no additional learning is required, and it is equivalent to the City and Guilds 6072 Health and Safety Award, which allows the learner to proceed to the health and safety test. Here we can see examples of a selection of the questions from the on-screen test. Some are straight multiple choice, some are drag and drop, and others are pictures asking the learner to identify. This will be similar to what we do currently on many assessments, with the addition of a variety of question types. The test can be taken at any stage in the assessment process, although it is recommended that it is completed prior to the practical project and guided discussion. Now we'll take a look and go through the practical project. This is a new approach to assessment, but it uses many similar approaches we have used in different previous assessments, particularly when we consider design type assessments and practicals with supporting evidence such as materials lists. So whilst it's a new title, the approach will be familiar. The project is externally set, internally marked, and externally quality assured. This project will have three elements. The first element is planning, the second element is performing, and the third element is evaluating. And the learner will have 14 hours allocated for the planning element of all the three tasks, and then 40 hours allocated for the second element for the performing to cover again the three tasks. And finally, the third element, which is 6 hours allocated to evaluate all the three tasks in the project. The learner will not be able to use the time they have been given for each element for another element. For example, if they complete their planning in 12 hours, they may not use the other 2 hours for either the performing or the evaluating elements. The learner, however, will be required to devise plans for all three tasks, showing the approach they will have to take to undertake the work required in the tasks, which will be underpinned by an overall schedule of works. Once the task has been completed, they will be then required to evaluate their work, and they must adhere to all relevant health and safety rules and procedures at all times. The planning task will be undertaken in a classroom environment where they will have access to IT equipment and appropriate resources to carry out their research. These materials may include guidance notes, regulations and manufacturer's instructions, and trade literature. Questions they would have to ask themselves, for example, what does a good build or installation look like in my trade area? And secondly, how can I achieve this? Which will set them on the right track moving forward. Excuse me. Requirements for the performing elements can be found in section 3 of the Practical Project Guide, which contains project briefs for each trade. If the learner, once again, completes in less time, they cannot use the extra time in the other elements of this project or take time from other elements to add time here. Once learners have completed the performing element of the project, they must produce one evaluation report which reflects on the whole project and includes the three tasks. This, once again, will be undertaken in a classroom environment under supervision from centre staff, ensuring learners have access to their planning documentation to support their review and evaluation. With regards to the marking of the planning, performing and evaluation, there is a marking grid located within the assessment pack to be used for each element. We will, however, be taking a deeper dive into the marking grid in future dedicated sessions. So please look out for future webinars and possibly face-to-face sessions should restrictions reduce in future. Here we can see an example of the practical project that provides an assessment brief, and this is to try and make the assessment as realistic as we possibly can and prepare the learner accordingly. The assessment is made up of 3 tasks, which you can see. Task 1 constructing a single lap tiling to a hip and valley, roof and dry verge, dry hip, and an open GRP, valley, etc. And 20 hours is allocated to complete this activity. And task 2 is a double lap plain tiling to a roof with GRP equipment, and then 12 hours is allocated accordingly. Task 3, now we can see different material as they have to use natural slate to a roof with an eave ventilation system. This also includes using lead soakers, and time allocated is 8 hours. The hours allocated to complete each task are guides. But what is good to remember is the learner cannot take any longer than the 40 hours to complete the 3 tasks that's contained within this element of performing. Each task has set measurements that the learner will have to work towards. As we've mentioned, these sample assessments will be available from the Skills for Wales website week commencing the Monday the 10th of May. So when you get the opportunity, please take a look. Continuing from the previous slide, which referred to the 3 tasks the learner would have to complete, you can see on the left of the screen the materials list and the tools and equipment that will be required. There will, however, be an overview materials list for the centre to help plan and prepare. But this, along with tools and equipment lists, is not to be shared with the learner, as they will make their own as part of their planning activity. The right-hand side of the slide shows the marking grid. This grid helps us to grade the learner as we use the grid to apply marks, such as the number of defects or tolerances are used to mark each task. This is an approach used in some previous qualifications, so should be familiar to tutors, but if not, it's a fairly straightforward method and is similar to the approach on the Skills for Wales competitions. The guided discussion, which is the final part of the assessment process, is in 2 parts and has got to be completed in one time session. It is internally marked and externally verified, and it's got to be completed in 40 minutes, with an extra 5 minutes can be allocated to complete their final question. This method of assessment will explore learner knowledge within their chosen pathway. It will also explore the knowledge and understanding of self-employed in their chosen pathway. It is recommended that a gap of no more than 3 weeks is left between the learner's finalisation of their project and completion of the guided discussion. Moving forward, we will take a deeper dive into the guided discussion as an assessment method in future dedicated sessions. So please look out for future webinars and possibly face-to-face sessions should restrictions reduce in future. We will, through email alerts and updated emails that we send out on a monthly to update people, just keep you informed of these. But in case you miss them, please keep an eye out on the Skills for Wales website. To complete this section of the presentation, here is an overview of the assessments we have briefly covered for the progression qualification. Learners will receive provisional grades for the assessments within 1 week of completion. Qualifications will undergo internal and external quality assurance, and the final grading will be issued by City and Guilds. It is, however, worth noting the slight change in procedure to current qualifications. This is to enable City and Guilds to quality assure and calculate the grading based on results across all three assessments. If a learner fails to successfully achieve a pass grade in any of the assessments, then they are permitted to resit or resubmit, and there are no limits to reassessment. However, time may become an issue, as learners will require further training and reinforcement prior to further attempts. I would now like to pass you back to David, who will take you through the next items on the agenda. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Ian, and welcome back, everyone. We're going to move on now and have a look at some of the resources. Thank you, Ian. So you may have seen some of this supporting information in previous webinars, but I'll quickly cover some of this again as a recap and for those who may not have seen it before. So firstly, to help with initial setup, our resource document gives an overview of the requirements to deliver and offer the qualifications. Please access this document in your planning meetings to help answer those questions on resources and staffing. We also have a prospectus, which will help centres create their own promotional literature and help provide information for learners, parents, and employers. Here we can see an exemplar of our adaptable delivery planner. We do have a blank version, as it's likely that each centre will consider delivery differently, such as the duration you run each unit and when you build in your practicals. The planner has a row for you to input your units and then the weeks to tick off as you work through the content of each unit. To support your CPD, we will be releasing a quarterly newsletter with links to various opportunities to engage with learning experiences. These may be links to dedicated videos, new manufacturers, manufacturers news, and so on. In addition, as you can see on the next slide, we are creating a resource section on the Skills for Wales website to collect learning resources from third parties such as providers and centres. We will also link to relevant courses from trade and industry bodies such as CITB, CIPHE, NFB, and any associated e-learning. This slide shows some dates you can expect to see the materials become available, such as new tutor resources and CPD resources, which will start to become available from April and May, with more becoming available in subsequent months. Delivery and assessment guidance will be available from September 21. We have a completely new suite of tutor resources, as you can see on this slide. These have been offered for review, so if you'd like an early look at these, although they're in the final stages of development, please let us know. But these include typically support materials such as presentations, question papers, and worksheets. We have a dedicated foundation book created by Hodder Education to support delivery and learning across all 6 core units in the foundation qualification. There is a sample chapter which can be accessed through the link on this slide. But in addition to this, on the progression qualifications, Hodder are creating a free mapping document into the current trade-specific textbooks, so they can be used with a new suite of qualifications. So let's move on now and have a look at some of our next steps. Here we can see several key dates. A couple I'd like to highlight are the overview teaching and learning webinars, which we are currently planning for May 21, and the follow-up to these, which will hopefully be face-to-face as soon as the next academic year starts, but we'll have to consider how we can run those. The next slide shows the current transition requirements, which have been discussed before, and Qualification Wales have run webinars on these which are available to view. But let's have a brief recap. A learner completing a broad level 1 qualification this year, it's suggested, could progress onto the foundation. Some completing a trade specific level 1 may progress to the foundation or progression. This would depend on the suitability of the learner to go into that progression or to go into the progression qualification at that stage. Whereas a learner completing a level 2 trade specific this year may progress to the progression or the level 3 trade specific. There are also other options, and we suggest you consider this diagram when considering suitable destinations for learners. Whereas the next slide shows the journey for learners starting in 2022, showing a broad level 1 and foundation as suitable starting points and a new apprenticeship for learners who are employed. So this graph or graphic looks a lot more straightforward. That's because by 22 we've moved across to the full new suite of qualifications. And here we have a link to all the current and future webinars. So we're working our way through these currently. Please take a look at these upcoming webinars. If there are any others or others that come available that you're interested in, but you may not be available, please consider registering anyway, because if you can't make it live, the system will send you an automatic email within 24 hours with a link to the recording. So it saves you having to search for the recording afterwards. So we do have a couple of slides left, but what we'll do now is we'll just pause for a brief moment whilst we give you an opportunity to reflect on a lot of those slides. Please type in your questions. It may be questions, it may be feedback, it may be just topics you wish to discuss again. There may be some slides we didn't describe in detail and you'd like us to double back over and describe again. So anything at all that you feel as though you'd like us to cover, we're more than happy to do so. If there aren't any natural questions coming through, we will move on to the final couple of slides eventually, and we won't make you stay on this webinar any longer than you need to, but we do want to give you all the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have, because we're hopefully here to answer those questions for you. Just before I check those questions, I'd just like to say at this point a big thanks to Anne Harrod for opening up, and to Ian Roberts for delivering the main part of the presentation, and also to Ian for bringing together all the content of this presentation. There's a lot of content brought in from other parts of the consortium, and pulling that information together has been time consuming. So thank you very much, Ian, for that. Just before I check in, a question that's come up a couple of times, would you be able to just give us a quick insight into how the 3 core units came about and how they may be delivered?
Yes, David, and thank you for the question. If we look back at the qualifications we reviewed that they carried out and the outcome of the review, it clearly identified that employers, especially employers, learners, and tutors who they actually discussed this with and everyone else, is that there were a need to clearly identify and inviting people into the construction industry to clearly show them what progression or opportunities there is within the industry itself. And this is something that's been previously clearly identified as lacking, for example, and that's one of the reasons they brought these 3 core units out for. And if we look at the first one, which is employability in the construction sector, it's mainly to cover that as well. So it's not just about what opportunities are within the industry, but what opportunities are if you become self-employed, subcontracting, set up your own business and things like that to be able to move it forward. So it's covering on them angles as well. And then when you look at changing practices over time, which is Unit 202, although it's looking at pre-1919 buildings, and it's also then moving into the 21st century as well, the new technologies that's around. And it's to ensure that learners have a good knowledge of understanding of what they're actually doing when they're working on historical buildings or pre-1919 buildings. So when they're maintaining these buildings, they can get a good knowledge and understanding so they don't cause any more detriment to the building by not carrying out or using the correct materials while working on the buildings. And that can easily happen, as we all know, moving that forward. But it's also as well for the new technologies. You know, the emerging technologies, exactly what is happening. What is 3D? What is building information and modelling? How effective can drones be, especially for roof slating and tiling, when you're looking at maintaining them? And that is a great way forward to help people to be able to see, look closely at roofing when you're at ground level, no matter what height it is, to be able to move that forward. And then we come then to the final unit, which is 203, which is planning and evaluating work in the construction sector. But the crucial part about this is it's in Wales. Not what's happening in England or Scotland, it's what's happening in Wales. So they can get a good knowledge and understanding of planning the work, evaluating the work when they've completed it in the construction sector that relates specifically to Wales for the pre-1919 buildings. How is emerging new technologies coming on board in that? So they can plan it effectively and they can evaluate and look at the quality, the provision that they're actually doing there as well. So that's the main purpose of bringing them 3 core units in. And it's not just for roof slating and tiling, it's the same 3 core units that David mentioned to cover all the trade areas. So all the learners starting on these progression qualifications all cover the same. So they get a good broad knowledge and understanding of what's expected from them moving forward. I hope that answers the question, David.
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much. Well, we've no new questions in, Ian. So if we can just go to the last couple of slides, please. So we'll just call out for your feedback, please. There's often, I know what it's like, you come to these sessions, you'll always ask for feedback, but I think this development is relatively unique in the development of qualifications because we've been developing these alongside providers and employers and running, as was face-to-face sessions and now webinars, and Ian's run many Teams calls alongside these, and we've been sharing information ongoing, and all of that has helped shape the qualification structure and how we provide our support, and that's only because we can receive feedback. So just a big shout out really. So when you will get a follow-up email with a link to feedback, please just take a couple of minutes to respond to that. And also when you get a chance to type, if you can put in there anything that you like, so positive things as well. If there's things that are good, that's good about the qualification. Anything good you feel about the support that you're getting, but also then things that you think that we could do better at, or maybe you'd like to see different. The more comments we get, the more information we have to make those changes. And it also shapes our support for you moving forward with these qualifications. So if you like webinars, if you like face-to-face, if you like the support, please do make a note of that in your feedback. We would appreciate that. And on the final slide, if you've got any sort of sticking points or queries, you can always come to myself, Anne Harrod, or Ian. But in addition to that, we do have a central email address, skillsforwales.customer@sittingills.com. If you're a centre with worries about registering learners or getting approval, if you're an employer and you're considering the employer sign-off or confirmatory sign-off and how that might work, any queries like that you'd like answers on, by all means come to myself or Ian. But if it goes through that email, it will be centrally logged and we can keep an eye on how many queries are coming in about the same topics and also share it with the most appropriate person to answer your query. So please make a note of that. I'll just check back now on the questions. It doesn't look like we've got any further questions, Ian. So we'll just give people final couple of moments to type away any questions that they might have. If they don't, again, it will just remain for us to say thank you very much for your attendance. We do appreciate how tough it is at your centres and for employers currently, particularly this time of year in education. There's a lot of pressure with the help supporting learners to hopefully get their achievements. So we understand that. So we are grateful for you taking your time out to come and listen to us and take part in this presentation. And we hope you have a safe evening, and yeah, just stay safe, everyone, and thank you.
Yes, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and keep safe, and I've no doubt we'll talk soon. But really appreciate you giving your time this afternoon. But your feedback is most valuable. We need your feedback, please. Okay, thank you. Take care, everybody.
So following that, I can see there's no final questions, so it seems an appropriate time to close. So for the final time, thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe and enjoy your evening. Thank you. Goodbye.